All right. Well, we're moving towards a close here on our focus on eschatology. Probably just a few more discussions on it. We've been looking most recently the last several sessions, which have extended over a long period of time with me being gone traveling and other interruptions. But um, we've been focusing on the different millennial views. And so I just wanted to sort of quickly, by way of overview, just because I know not all of us have been able to attend each of the sessions on the millennial views, is just give a quick summary of the three major views, and then we'll dive into the third one here this morning. But of course, you guys are familiar with the premillennial view, which is that there's the second coming, Christ, precedes a literal 1,000-year period where Christ will reign as king on the earth in fulfillment of the messianic prophecies regarding his reign upon the earth. Zechariah 14 comes to mind in particular. And Revelation 20, of course, lays out the time period of that reign as 1,000 years. So again, that's something I think we're all pretty familiar with, as well as sort of another view, another predominant view is amillennialism, which of course doesn't see the 1,000 years as literal. It does identify a millennium, so to speak, of the spiritual reign of Christ. And so the in amillennial is really a reference to no literal. And I'd emphasize, highlight no literal millennial kingdom, but they still believe in a reign of Christ, that it's taking place now, beginning at the cross, that the church age is the quote unquote millennial kingdom. It's taking place now, but not literally here on earth. And then of course there's no tribulation. The second coming is really the next major event in the end times. Whereas for the premillennial view, the next major event would be the rapture, at least for the pre-trib guy raptures. If you're not pre-trib rapture, you at least believe in the tribulation if you're premillennial. And so that would be the ushering in of the tribulation would be the next major event in God's program. But amillennialism doesn't adhere to that. They would just see that we're in the millennium now, that will come to a close at the second coming, which is when we will go to the eternal state. And if you remember, it's this age and the age to come. So they just see the two distinct periods of time there. This age being the church age, the age to come being the eternal state. And then we have postmillennialism, which believes that Christ's second coming follows after a literal millennial kingdom. And the 1,000 years to them also is symbolic, but the kingdom itself is literal on earth. That's the main distinction between postmillennialism and amillennialism. Because you might look at amillennialism and see, hey, it looks like the same chart, the same timeline here between the two. In fact, if I move it up a little bit, you could say, well, they kind of look pretty much the same. What's the distinction between the views? Well, there's a couple. One distinction is that the amillennial position sees the millennial kingdom in a more spiritual sense, a spiritual reign of Christ on the throne of David in heaven, whereas postmillennial, the idea there is more of this literal kingdom on earth, similar to the premillennial view. The second thing is that the church age moves towards a golden age, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. As opposed to, so there's a change in the nature of the millennial kingdom in the postmillennial view, as opposed to the amillennial view. But in both systems, the second coming indicates the end of millennial kingdom and the movement towards an eternal state. But there's many aspects to the postmillennial position that are very similar to the amillennial. Okay, so I want to now just focus our attention on the postmillennial view. We looked at some of this in our last session together, so I'll just highlight a couple of things. One thing that I just mentioned was that postmillennialism has some elements of amillennialism, that there are only two ages, this age, the age to come. And thus, this age is the age of the kingdom, millennial kingdom, and the age to come being the eternal state. Whereas in premillennialism, we have the church age, followed by the tribulation, followed by the second coming, followed by a millennial kingdom on earth, and then comes final judgment, the eternal state. Whereas in post-mill and amillennialism, they would see the second coming, judgment, the eternal state, that all happens at the same time. Whereas in premillennialism, as shown by the timeline here, premillennialism has the second coming and the judgment, eternal state at distinctly different times. All right, so for postmillennialism, it has some overlap with amillennialism, and then it does have something in common with premillennialism, which is the idea of a physical kingdom on earth taking place. Now, as we discussed with the history of this view, there's not really any evidence that I'm aware of in the first few centuries of the church of the postmillennial position. It's believed that basically after Augustine sort of formalized amillennialism in, what is it, 4th century, I think, when Augustine was around, there were some who did not fully agree with that, because they would see, as we would see, in the Old Testament and the New, physical aspects of the kingdom. And so they turned either to premillennialism, which had been there before amillennialism, or a postmillennial view. And so some of the seeds of that position took place around the time of Augustine. And what really took off later, several centuries later, with industrialism, colonialism. So there was a sort of idea of the world becoming smaller, and how many of the culture of the West, so to speak, of Western Europe, was now propagating around the world. There was a growth of Western society, industrialism, and many of these elements sort of brought about a rise in post-millennialism. And I'll explain why in a minute. But so many of the Puritans held to a post-millennial view. And it actually became a predominant view in the 18th and 19th centuries. But of course, after World War I was followed not long after by World War II, postmillennialism pretty much died. Because in the view of postmillennialism, things would be getting better. The gospel would be spreading, that lead to a golden age where a majority of the earth is Christian. Well, after 2 world wars, it's like that people started to rethink that. They wrongly applied the hermeneutic, as we talked about ages ago now, with hermeneutics of prophetic genre, right? We don't let the front page news determine our interpretation of eschatology. But after those 2 world wars, it was really hard for people who were post-millennial to see that position as tenable, especially when you had guys like Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini, and then the tens of millions of people who were slaughtered during the war, the Holocaust. I mean, it really caused a lot of disillusion among the post-millennial guys, so that almost went away. But not long after, actually, less than 20 years later, in the late 1950s, Lorraine Bettner reintroduced or reinvigorated the post-millennial position with his book known as just called The Millennium, which he published in 1957. And that really formed the seeds of a new resurgence in postmillennialism in the last 20, 30 years, maybe a little longer, 40 years. There's been a rise in postmillennialism, and there's a number of people, especially in the US, who are now holding to that view. I think R.C. Sproul had some adherence to it as well. At least he spoke very favorably of it, from what I can remember. Any questions on that brief overview before we dive into the key aspects of postmillennialism? Okay, as you know, you can always interrupt me at any time if you have any questions or comments if you want to give. Okay, so the key aspects of postmillennialism. Again, we covered some of these last time, but I do want to highlight them because we're this morning going to basically give a critique of these. One of the key aspects is regarding the kingdom of God. They don't see that as a future event like premillennialists, premillennial futurists would now, where we see that the millennial kingdom is in the future and it will be ushered in by the return of Christ. Or rather, they would see, no, it's not a future occurrence, but it's a present reality. And yes, it is taking place on earth, just as premillennialists would affirm that it's a literal kingdom on earth. But they would see a slight distinction that we view, the premillennial view is that it's a literal kingdom on earth, Christ reigning on earth, literally. Whereas postmillennial would have to, they hold to an earthly reign of Christ, but he's not literally here. So in their position, it would be sort of he's ruling in the hearts of believers. So there is that distinction. And they would see the kingdom beginning, this millennial kingdom taking place beginning at the first advent, really inaugurated at the cross, beginning at the cross. And so I would say we're in this literal kingdom now, and this kingdom is growing. It's growing. There's a spread of the gospel that's inherent in postmillennialism. And by spread of the gospel, I don't just mean that, the gospel, the evangelism, but actually conversion. Because they believe that as the gospel goes forth, not only being preached around the world, but they would see that they would say the Bible teaches that it will be effective, and that a majority of the world at some point will become Christian. And that at that point, and the majority of people on the earth are believers, that this will usher in what some call as the golden age. And some postmillennialists would refer to that as the time period of the actual millennium. But this golden age will be one where, again, the majority of the earth is Christian, and it's a time of widespread peace and righteousness. So you can see why after World War II, which came, less than 20 years after World War I ended, or sorry, do my math right, well, 25 years, that, many were kind of like, oh, I don't really see this progressing to a time of peace and righteousness. It's actually the opposite's happening. So we can see why postmillennialism took a dive after World War II, because of this view that the gospel will be effective. It won't just spread in terms of being preached, but it will spread in terms of being received. They would view, so Isaiah 11 is one key passage. I'll just have us take a quick look at it here. Isaiah 11. And I'm going to ask Tabs to read this one. Isaiah 11, describing this future time under the reign of the Messiah. If you could read verses through 9, Tabs.
Okay, Pastor.
Here, I'll expand a little more.
Isaiah 11, 6 to 9. And the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf, and the young lion, and the fatling together, and a young boy will lead them. Also, the cow and the bear will graze, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. And the nursing baby will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will do no evil nor act corruptly in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of Yahweh, as the waters cover the sea.
All right, so notice that they would attribute this to the millennial reign of the Messiah. And notice the description here. I mean, what's the picture? And we have these expressions here of right, the wolf and the lamb, the leopard and the goat, the cow and the bear. Lion will eat straw, not other animals. You know, the baby and the cobra. That this imagery of peace, right, where the Messiah, righteousness and faithfulness will be reigning. And so they would say this passage, along with a few others, demonstrates this golden age of peace, which they say will take place in the millennial kingdom as the majority of the earth has become Christian and moved into this golden age. Again, the millennium then, it's not considered a literal 1,000 years, but just a long period of time, just like the amillennialists. They would say 1,000, the number 1,000, Revelation 20 is symbolic. It just represents a long period of time. The close of the millennium will take place. There will be a surge in evil. There will be an apostasy in connection with the Antichrist. A surge in evil will take place when he comes. So they're not denying that there will be a time of evil, because they recognize that the Christ, when he returns, will defeat all of his enemies. But they're saying basically there'll just be this general period of growth in the gospel to the point majority of the earth becomes Christian. And then we will see at that point a time period of peace and righteousness, which, you know, I don't want to set up straw men and mock other views, but I'm kind of like, have these guys been in churches lately? Just because everybody's Christian or claims to be Christian doesn't mean everything is great. Unfortunately. Christians have not done such a great job of being diligent to preserve the unity within the body. So just because everyone, majority will be Christians, in the end, there's still going to be humans who struggle with sin and conflict and disunity. It's been around in the church ever since the church began. So it's not like just because most people are Christian doesn't mean that sin is eliminated and everything's going to be wonderful. Certainly, generally be better than, of course, Satan reigning and what's happening in this world system. But anyway, I guess, maybe they all go to churches that everything's great and they don't have any problems. But anyway, that's just my own thoughts, opinions. But in any case, in the post-millennial, everything's great. So church splits and all that other kind of stuff just isn't going to happen in the golden age. And it'll be this great period of peace and righteousness with, again, sort of at the very end, this surge in, with the introduction of the Antichrist, there'll be a surge in evil, there'll be an apostasy, and then Christ will return. At that point, bring judgment, usher in the eternal state, and that will be that. So that's the their position regarding that, as best I can understand it. So that's their view of the millennium. Then, of course, like the amillennialists, because many post-millennial guys are essentially, for the most part, covenantal. So they also hold to the same view as the amillennial guys, that there is no future for national Israel, for ethnic Jews. It's all about the seed of Abraham is now the church. So it's spiritual Israel is the church. So the same ideas that many of the Old Testament prophecies are now applied to the church. Most postmillennials believe the promises get made to Abraham and following are to the church, and they would have the same view, the same perspective, the same position as amillennialists in that regard, because both come out of a covenantal perspective regarding the theme of Scripture. And in that view, national Israel is no longer part of God's redemptive program. Okay, so the last two positions, the millennium and the national Israel, they would be in agreement with the amillennialists in that regard. Somebody have a question or
So
comment?
Tim,
Yeah.
so the Jews in that view will now be assimilated into the church, because these Jews, in their view, at least most of them would come to Christ and therefore be assimilated into the church.
Yeah, they would just be, that some Jews will become Christian, but as far as a national revival of national Israel, as we would hold to, where all Israel be saved, they wouldn't hold to that position necessarily. I mean, there's always, as any theological position, any doctrinal view, there's always variation. So there may be some that would closer to where we're at, some aspects. But I think, for the mainstream post-millennial guy, just like the mainstream amillennial guy, it will be that, national Israel's out of the picture. So there are Jews that will come to Christ, just as there are, every flavor of Gentile will come to Christ. But it's all about the church at this point. So the recognition of national Israel, of ethnic Jew, that there'll be a complete restoration, salvation for ethnic Israel, that would be rejected by the mainstream. So these two positions on the millennium and national Israel would be common with both amillennial and postmillennial guys, whereas the spread of the gospel in the kingdom, that would be a distinction from amillennialism. So this is where their view would be different than amillennial view. Okay, so that's just an overview summary of what we covered last time. Those are the four sort of major aspects of postmillennialism. Okay, so I think, one of the helpful aspects of the postmillennial view is it really did lead to a surge in a focus on evangelism and missions, because there's this effort, right? We want to save the world. We want to bring about a majority of the earth to be Christians, so that we can usher in this golden age that will bring about second coming. We want Jesus to return, right? We want to see people come to know him. And so I think the postmillennial view just further motivated them to be evangelistic, to be purposeful in outreach locally and globally. And so I think that's a positive element to the position. I think that's a good thing. You know, maybe their end goal reasoning for it, or what they're trying to do as a result of it, we would disagree with, but the desire and the efforts made, the carrying out of the evangelistic endeavor, focus on global mission. I mean, that's a good thing that we can learn from them. All right. So, but with that, I have a number of concerns or disagreements with some of their other key elements of the position. So I just wanted to go over those with you and get your thoughts as well. But just in what we've talked about so far, what are some things that you guys might see as concerns or issues from what we've just briefly discussed to this point? Anybody want to offer their perspectives on anything that we've talked about as far as where we might have a concern or differing point of view?
I would my perspective on their pointing out a sudden surge in apostasy that would give rise to the Antichrist. I don't think it's a sudden surge, because even with regard to what's happening now, it's been happening progressively, and it's not sudden. It's just that I personally believe it's these past few years, it has worsened more quickly. It's continuing, in my perspective at least, to be doing that. So it's kind of hard how they could explain the sudden surge, when they say that most of the earth will be believers. Okay, so that's just my concern.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not like, I mean, if you think about, of course, as I mentioned, both world wars, sort of how that affected their perspective, but it's not just, violence and murder and death and war that we've seen an increase in, at least at that time. But just look at the moral decay. I mean, we can't say that any nation is becoming more godly or more righteous. Suppose the U.S., right? Supposedly the Christian nation on the earth. I mean, we're more decadent than most of the globe now as a nation, and what's being endorsed and promoted and exported. But yes, all around the world, right? You're seeing the surge in sexual perversity and what's being, even our own identities as humans and what that, with gender and the other things. And so these things are only increasing. And so it's not just, okay, maybe there's less people dying because of war, but there's still wars happening. But it doesn't mean that, things are probably getting better. It's actually getting worse in so many other ways. That's hard for me to see sort of like a sudden surge. Like, I agree with you. It's just been getting worse and worse in a moral sense.
Yeah, if I may add, Pastor Tim, and it's not just what is happening in the world, but The scriptures actually presents that it will get worse instead of get better and better. Like for example, Second Timothy chapter 3, in the latter days, perilous times shall come, and Paul lists the moral decays, like people will be lovers of self, lovers of money more than lovers of God, and so it kind of opposes the teaching that the view that things will get better and better in the end.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's definitely one passage that comes to mind, right? um, when you think about this, or even Jesus in Matthew 24, right? He describes a period of time, not just an instant of time, but a period of time where things are going to be bad. So that really, yeah, it's one of the areas that I focus on as far as problems or concerns I have with the view. The first we tackle is just the spread of the gospel. Really, and I noted that a moment ago, but certainly Scripture teaches the gospel is going to be proclaimed throughout the world, but not that it will be accepted throughout the world. Here's a few passages that came to my mind. Maybe if Harris, you want to read these here that are on the screen, if you can see them, okay.
Yes, Pastor Tim. Matthew 24:14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in the whole world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Acts 1:8, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, go ahead and read all three of them. Yeah.
All right. Acts 1:8, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the end of the earth. Revelations 14:6. Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who inhabit the earth and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people.
Okay, and notice I highlighted this. We do see the idea of that it'll be proclaimed, right? Matthew 24 shall be proclaimed in the whole earth to all the nations. Acts 1:8, you shall be my witnesses. Again, that's the idea of proclamation, right? To the end of the earth. Revelation 14, an eternal gospel to proclaim, to preach to every tribe, tongue, and nation. So these passages certainly affirm that the gospel is going to be preached and should be preached throughout the earth. Even the Great Commission, right? Make disciples of all the nations. So it's commanded, you know, preach the gospel to the whole earth. And it's even be my witnesses to the end of the earth. And then at some point in Revelation, it said the whole earth will hear the gospel. God's going to make sure of that. All right. So yes, I would affirm a spread in the gospel in terms of the proclamation of the gospel, that it's commanded, and in these passages affirm that that's going to happen. So there's no disagreement there. But Jesus did not, when he commanded to make disciples of all the nations, he did not in that guarantee all the nations would become disciples. The command's to make disciples of all the nations, but there wasn't a promise attached to that all the nations would become disciples. There will be disciples from all the nations, every tribe, tongue, and people. That's what it says in Revelation, that people from every tribe, every tongue, every nation will be gathered around the throne. But again, Jesus said, make disciples of all the nations, not that all the nations will become disciples. So Jesus declared his authority in the Great Commission, reinforcing the need to obey the command, and that he would be there to empower them, right? I'll be with you to the end of the age. But again, there's no explicit statement that a majority of the earth will become Christian. In fact, did not Jesus really say the opposite? Can you guys think of any texts where Jesus said actually a minority of the people are going to be saved? Do any passages come to mind that indicate that?
Broad is the way that leads to destruction, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, right. Broad is the way, leads to destruction, but narrow is the gate that leads to life. And there are few, he said in Matthew 7, that find it. So that pretty much says the opposite. Matthew 22, I think I put these texts on the notes here. Yeah, so there's Matthew 7. The gate is small, the way is narrow that leads to life. And then Matthew 22, verse 14, he says, many are called, but few are chosen. Now, what does the word few mean? F-E-W, right? I mean, these two passages, that's what he says. There are few who will find the way. There are few who are chosen. That's not a majority. So, unfortunately, that's what Christ has predicted, that the majority of the earth will not become Christians. Now, at the end of the day, there will be myriads and myriads, as we see in Revelation, but that's of all human history. But right now, I mean, I don't know. Honestly, the actual born again, population on the earth right now, it's, not that many. So the kingdom parables, they would point to the kingdom parables, talk about like the mustard seed becoming this great tree. So yes, the gospel will spread and grow, but there's no promise anywhere that that majority of the earth will be Christian. And as I said, there are statements to the effect that the opposite is said, that actually it's going to be few. So again, the spread of the gospel, yes, that will be universal at some point, but the acceptance of the gospel will not be. At least from how I understand scripture. Yeah, Robbie.
Yeah, it's happening even now in the church. I think there are many are falling away, following false doctrines and false preachers. Many preachers are disqualifying themselves and still having a good number of followers. And we've seen that over the last few years, especially pastors disqualifying themselves or turning away from the faith, and actually even being happy about that, testify of how happy they are now. Happy.
Yeah. Yep.
So God is still sifting his church, I guess.
Yes. So, I mean, that's one area, the acceptance of the gospel not be, and we already talked about this, and Harris brought up, I think, a key text. The world's not getting better.
Mm.
In fact, as Harris pointed out from 2 Timothy, it's going to be going the opposite direction. And that was kind of the point I was making. And we're seeing this play out. The morality of many around the world is going the other direction. And Matthew, Jesus pointed this out in the Olivet Discourse as well. So evil men and impostors will proceed from bad to worse, deceiving, being deceived. Notice, so I think that makes it pretty clear, at least to me. Regarding Revelation, the 1,000-year reign, we'd already spent time on that. We discussed in response to the amillennialism. So I'm not going to give that a lot of time here. Just to say in our position is that should take it as literal, because again, in interpreting prophetic passages, you assume literal unless something in the text guides us otherwise. And so we had talked about that, and even in the many passages in Old Testament prophecy, there is a clearly identified a time of Messiah reigning on earth. And the 1,000 years is never mentioned until we get to Revelation 20, but certainly the concept and the principle of a kingdom on earth is laced throughout. And of course, going back to our one of our foundational passages that we talked about at the beginning of this eschatology discussions and sessions, is the disciples' question, is that now you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel, national Israel. And as we remember, Jesus did not correct that view, only that the timing of it. So it's not for you to know when that's going to happen. Right now, you need to be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. So again, we spent quite a bit of time on that in a previous session, as well as the other topic regarding their position on national Israel. We spent quite a bit of time there as well. We walked through Romans 9 through 11 that focused on ethnic Israel, as Paul was talking about his brothers according to the flesh. You just go through that text. It's very clear in the context that Paul is referring to ethnic Jews. And then, of course, he goes all the way through Jeremiah 31, the new covenant being given to them, and then that covenant will be fulfilled. In Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved in response to God's promise. And so that's ethnic Israel. It's not speaking of the church. They're distinct from Israel, but that ethnic Israel would be saved. So again, we spent quite a bit of time on that before when we responded to the amillennial position. So I don't want to go back into that here, unless there are some questions or comments about that. Anything on those areas? Again, this is just I'm trying to treat this sort of in an overview fashion. We could go and look at several passages together in more detail, but I think just want to address this more in a general sense. Just give you a few of the key texts, but any thoughts or questions on those before looking at one particular aspect of postmillennialism? There is a more extreme position within postmillennialism that you guys may have heard of, called theonomy. Anyone familiar with that? Theonomy is the idea of God and law, right? Nomos, law, theos, God. And so it's a more extreme view, but there's, even where I live in this region of the US, this is becoming more, probably surged, I don't know, the last 20 years or so. But theonomy is sort of the viewpoint. Again, I would call this more an extreme position within the post-mill world is that the Mosaic law is still in force, including its consequences. There's an element of reconstructionism in the theonomist view that the way the world's going to become Christianized is by means of the law and the lordship of Christ, and that dominion theology is our goal is to bring the world under Christ's lordship. So it's not just the spread of the gospel, but it's actually really implementing the Mosaic law, and so by that conforming people of the earth to that law. And here's a thing, I'll have Robbie have you read this. This is from David Chilton. Expresses this perspective.
The Christian goal for the world is the universal development of biblical theocratic republics, in which every area of life is redeemed and placed under the lordship of Jesus Christ and the rule of God's law. Our goal is world dominion under Christ's lordship, a world takeover, if you will, but our strategy begins with reformation, reconstruction of the church. From that will flow social and political reconstruction, indeed a flowering of Christian civilization.
So yeah, that's pretty direct. It's like,
Yeah.
so these guys are, pretty extreme.
Yeah.
And again, this is not the mainstream post-millennial perspective. This is one segment, extreme position, but I just thought it'd be helpful for you at least to be aware of the terminology if you hear about or come across. There's a movement then by theonomists to actively engage in the public structures of society and politics, things like that, in order to promote God's law and its enforcement. Again, their view is not to seek escape from the world, but rather to implement change in the world, but not, my perspective or view, not implement change by changing the heart, but by sort of enforcing a Christian worldview on the world. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but I see some obvious problems with this position. I mean, anything that sticks out to you, again, I've just presented you just the basic overview, but just in listening and hearing that, I mean, your response be biblically to that
Is the present dominion theology that has been popular in many churches, many of them Pentecostal churches, over the last few decades, is it rooted in this theonomy or?
Yeah, I think
Somehow.
so. It's kind of like the old crusade mentality, to be honest. Not an exact same way. I mean, the Crusaders, right? It was become a Christian or die. Like the Muslims today, the extremists, become Muslim or die. Right? It's the terrorist that I met with. I mean, that was his strategy to me. If you won't convert, then you should be killed. But so they wouldn't be that extreme, but it's still the mentality is there of like forcing change by imposing Christian, Christianized, and even again a Mosaic law, kind of 10 Commandments sort of perspective. But yeah, the dominion theology, a lot of the, sort of enforcing change in the world. Let's get involved in politics and let's get involved in schools. And we should be, as Christians, seeking to be influencers in
Oh,
all the spheres in society, but not to enforce change by law, but to seek change through
mm,
conversion, right? Because it's, as you guys know, right? What changes heart,
mm,
right? The law merely exposes what's in the heart, the sin in the heart, but the law can't change it. Right? Was it what text is it? The law, I think Romans 8, right? The law, weak as it was through the flesh, right, could not bring about permanent change. Galatians, right? The man is not justified, right, by works of the law, but through faith in Christ. For as many as of the works of the law are under a curse, right? So the law only exposes our sin and shows us that we can't keep it. So I mean, to me, that's an obvious issue with this idea of
mm.
we just impose Christian perspective and even enforce it. You know, that the gospel of grace is what's going to change the human heart. And again, the purpose of the law is simply to expose sin. Or one of the purposes of the law, it exposes our sin. That's why Paul calls it a tutor that leads us to Christ, a guide, if you will, that when we recognize we can't obey the law perfectly, that is what is used to drive us to our knees and seek God's mercy. Because we can't do it on our own. This is kind of one of the basics of the Christian faith and really of the Reformation, right?
Yeah.
And also to the mentality, who, and this is the one that I always thought, even with the post-mill guys, but definitely with this extreme position, who is it that brings Christ's kingdom?
Mm.
Who is it that decides Jesus's return? I mean,
God.
that's like, right? What did Jesus even say of that day and hour? No one knows but the Father alone. So it's not like God's, okay, I gotta wait until these people get the world ready for me. And when that happens, then I'll come. No, he's already determined
Mm.
what that day and hour is. And even Jesus said, as on the earth, as incarnate, he said the Son of Man doesn't even know. So how is it that these theonomists are going to make it happen? And of course, the old covenant. Are we under the old covenant? Do you remember, anyone remember a text or a passage that would remind us of that or teach us about that? Anything come to mind? Or the idea, the principle that the new covenant has replaced the old?
Um, the Lord Himself saying that in the Gospels that He had not come to abrogate the law, but to fulfill it.
Okay, right. That the law had not yet been fulfilled and it only is fulfilled in Christ. So there's a hint of it there. I remember I told a guy, I think we were in a Sunday school class and we were talking about the Ten Commandments. And I made the statement to the effect of, you're not bound by the Ten Commandments, that you aren't under them. You don't have to keep them. And he's like, what? And he just went ballistic. Like, he got so angry. And I wasn't saying that the Ten Commandments are irrelevant or unimportant or, you know, but my point was we're not under them. And so I tried to. He got so mad at that point I couldn't really reason with him anymore. But I tried to show him from Hebrews, actually, how, you know, again, the focus in Hebrews is on Christ as a mediator of a better covenant. Moses was the mediator of the old covenant, but Jesus is the mediator of the new. And if that first covenant, he says, had been faultless, there would have been no occasion sought for a second. Right? And then, of course, the author of Hebrews, he quotes the new covenant here. This is all Jeremiah 31. Okay, so he quotes from that, and then he gives comment. He says, when he said a new covenant, he made the first obsolete. Whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. And he made the first obsolete. All right, so the principle is, right, when something's becoming obsolete or growing old, it's ready to be done away with. Well, he says the old covenant has been made obsolete. So it's no longer in force. It's no longer necessary. It no longer has any teeth. The old covenant. And then he continues, right? Even the first covenant had requirements of worship. And he moves sort of in the direction of the importance, how the old covenant was used and pointed to the new covenant. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of good things, he entered through a grace. So he's saying the old covenant was a shadow through which the new covenant now is the substance. So the old covenant had value, had importance. It wasn't like without any purpose or relevance or importance. But he's saying it's disappeared. It's obsolete now. It fulfilled what it was intended to fulfill. It pointed to Christ. It showed that we are sinners in need of a savior. It exposed our sinful hearts. It drove us to understanding of that we need forgiveness. So the law accomplished what God intended for it, but it's not in force. It's obsolete. It's done away with. And so we're no longer under that covenant. And so, yeah, these guys who were, you know, trying to reimpose the Mosaic covenant, the laws, the 10 Commandments, I missed the point. You're trying to bring back what can't produce new life. All it can do is show the need for new life. And so we don't go back to Moses, who's the mediator of the old covenant. We want to go to Christ, who's the mediator of the new covenant. That's the author of Hebrews. That's his argument. Why would you go back? Now, and again, remember, that's what the people that he's writing to, some of them were considering that. They are Jews who had come to Christ, and then they were suffering. It wasn't as they expected. So they were thinking of going back to the Mosaic covenant. And author of Hebrews is saying, why in the world would you do that? Christ is a mediator of a better covenant. The old is now obsolete. So I think that whole argument of Hebrews 8 and 9, book of Hebrews, but especially chapter 8 and 9 would really apply to the theonomist perspective on the purpose of the law and imposing Christian values on a non-Christian culture. I mean, it'd be nice in a lot of ways, right? A lot of the sin that we see at least would be suppressed, but it's not going to change society, and it's not going to force the return of Christ. So that would be my perspective.
Yeah, wasn't your student possibly was just reacting to what he may have thought antinomianism um, in your statement, or did he really have a different perspective with regard to the law still being needed together with faith for salvation?
Yeah, I think I sort of learned in his case later. This was a guy in a Sunday school class at church.
Okay.
That he
Sunday school.
actually was, he had a works-based mentality as far as salvation, because later he walked away from the faith. He committed adultery, left his family. He'd been living under sort of this, works-based approach, and of course that. So he wasn't even saved as far as I could tell at that point. But I didn't see it at that time. It didn't come out till later. But yeah, I know some would react that way just because, yeah, like you said, just a concern for, if they think I meant, just the law doesn't matter, do what you want. But some might react that way if they think that's what's being said. But yeah, this guy, that wasn't the reason. A few helpful resources on postmillennialism. One, what's the other one? What's it called? Oh, I don't have that one. A couple of resources. I mean, if you want to get more, do some reading on your own. This is one called Christ's Victorious Kingdom, John Jefferson Davis. Again, it's a short treatment of it. If you're interested in learning more about postmillennialism, or the classic work by Lorraine Bettner, as I mentioned, The Millennium. Is another one that one's thicker book, but if you want to learn more, there are some, some of the systematic theologies that just, Wayne Grudem's book, a few others, if it'll describe or summarize the postmillennial position. You can take a look at those as well, but there's still a lot more that I don't fully understand about it. Would need to read more on it. I'm more comfortable, more familiar with amillennialism than post-millennialism, but at least wanted to give you guys a perspective on that. Now, there's a more another view. We've looked at the three major views: premillennial, post-millennial, amillennial. There's also a view, as you guys probably are aware of, called preterism. And I thought next time we gather, we could talk a little bit about that view, the preterist view. I don't know if it's how much if it's gaining really momentum or popularity. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. Are there any guys there that you're aware of that are preterists in the Philippines? It's
Not that I'm aware of.
yeah, I only see them when I go to like conferences. I'll see the guys there like at ETS or Goth C4G. Some of these I'll see a booth, that'll be set up. But honestly, that's the only time I've really interacted with any preterists or seen them. They're kind of a rare breed, I think. But it's helpful to at least be aware of the position, because you never know. Someone might be exposed to it, and so I thought I'd spend a little bit, maybe the next session, just a little time on looking at that by way of overview as well. So we can do that at that time. So if you don't know what a preterist is or haven't thought about it, you'll have to wait till next week and we'll cover that together. To me, it's one of the, I don't know, to me, it's just kind of a more odd position in my view, but maybe that means I don't understand it well enough, but it just, anyway, you'll see why I think that when we talk about it next week, but any other thoughts, comments, perspectives from anything we've talked about tonight or anything in general, eschatology or otherwise? Anybody have any? Would you say, do you encounter many folks that are post-millennial in your interactions? Would you say
From
that,
the,
oh, go
from
ahead.
the reform camp, Pastor Tim, from the
Uh,
reform.
the Reformed camp.
Would you say that postmillennialism is becoming more popular among them, or would amillennialists be the more common view with the reform guys there, at least that you know of?
Hmm.
I really don't know in Philippines. The guys I've come across there, the reform guys, are all mill, but
Hmm.
you know, I don't know. I mean, to me,
I think most of them are. I
sorry.
think most of them here. I think most of the Reformed there are still more Amil than post. So
I mean, really, the covenantal
I
movement.
also don't know. Yeah, I also don't know if that is also a reaction to to Pentecostals and
Mm,
charismatics being more pre-millennial. So I'm not so sure.
yeah. Huh. Yeah, because the covenantalism is kind of more recent development there in Philippines, right?
Mm. Mm.
But you're probably right, Robbie. I think somewhat of a reaction to, because a lot of Pentecostal charismatics sort of hold to a Arminian position, the gospel.
Mm.
Usually the covenantalists or reformed guys, it's a kind of rise up as a reaction to the Arminianist viewpoint. So they become reformed in their soteriology, um, like we are, but then they sort of keep going down that road because a lot of the
Mhm.
reformers were covenantal, mill
Mhm.
or post mill. So they tend to sort of, when they find out about these reform guys, they love the soteriology because that, you know, with election and those things which we hold dear, but then they kind of keep going down that road of what follows, which is the covenantal view of the other doctrines like eschatology, etc. So that's kind of what I've observed, at least here in the States. But as I like to, you know, as we talked about when we looked at covenantalism, really premillennial guys are more reformed. We fully reformed, right? We didn't just reform on our soteriology, we reformed on our eschatology. We moved completely away from the church. So they don't like being teased like that. So you guys are still got one foot in the door in the Catholic Church. You know, we're totally out. So they don't like that joke. So, but anyway, like I said, at the end of the day, we're still on the same page as far as Christ's return and the gospel, and that Christ will reign, will bring in judgment and the eternal state. So we're all in agreement with those things. So that's good.
Yeah, it's just that what's sad really is how many in the reformed group um, have really looked down on those who are not reformed as they are.
Yeah.
That's the sad thing.
Yeah. And then, of course, some have made it their mission to sort of correct churches rather than preach the gospel to the lost. So,
Yeah, and some even make fun of the premill view.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, why don't we finish up here? Let me ask, I don't know if Ence, if you're able to, if your signal's good enough, but if it is, could you close us in prayer?